the after effects of China's collapse, that I'm concerned about a little bit. Because it means that the workshop of the world and all its productive capacity, so China, Germany, the two greatest manufacturing economies in the world, are basically going away at the same time. Now, this is a primarily Texan crowd. You're all thinking, oh, well, but what about Mexico? Mexico's great, and Texas has a 30-year head start on everyone else in interacting with Mexico in a cooperative manner. The problem is that northern Mexico, the part that Texans think about, that's only 35 million people. About 2/3 of that labor is already spoken for. So if you're not getting your stuff from Mexico already, like chop chop, you're running out of time. Because you also have to do it in an environment of higher capital costs. All right, here's Mexico. Love it, love it, love it. It's not for everyone. Check this out. Mexico started industrializing in the 90s. Their population structure changed immediately. Now, this is not yet a problem. This is what happened in Germany in the 40s. So, they still have decades before this is really an issue, but it does mean that there is a light at the end of the tunnel and it is a train. So get to it. Okay, labor costs. Here are Southeast Asian countries, which I'm broadly positive on. Decent geography, good demographies. Here are our Mexican neighbors, very competitive right in the middle, and there are the Chinese. China is no longer the low-cost producer of anything. It's only the pre-existing sunk cost of the industrial plant, which is why we build things there still. Anyone who is relocated from China to North America has discovered lower production costs. Now, I realize you don't move that industrial plant overnight, but if it's going to die anyway, sooner rather than later. Okay, finally, and then we'll go to Q&A. Here's the CPI, inflation. For the United States and Canada, brother countries, similar economies, inflation tracks. 3 big phases. First, that post-war industrialization and urbanization phase. We built skyscrapers, we electrified the countryside, we built interstates everywhere. Industrial demand-driven inflation. The baby boomers. Largest generation we have came of age. Got jobs, founded the suburbs, raised kids. That's the biggest capital expenditure in most people's lives, homes and kids. Lasted for 25 years. And then we had this glorious moment that we all think of as normal. The Chinese poured 1 billion workers onto the global labor market, pushed down the cost of manufactured goods. The Russian system imploded, and an empire's worth of raw materials was poured onto international markets, keeping commodity prices under control. All of these trends are either coming back if they're inflationary or going away if they're disinflationary. We have to double the size of the industrial plant, preferably in the next 5 years. The boomers may be retiring, but the millennials are now at the peak of their consumption. The Russian stuff is going away, and Chinese labor is going away. We're looking at 9 to 15% inflation for a minimum of the next 5 years, just because of the macroeconomic trend. That assumes that government does not screw anything up. If we fail to double the size of the industrial plant, if we fail to expand that refining footprint, that 9 to 15% is our new normal from now on, and we will have product shortages. Or we can all participate in the fastest economic growth in American history to compensate. Let's assume for the moment that the Chinese could pull it off. If they get the semiconductor fab facilities, they don't know how to operate them, so they would just be dead letters. In addition, you would have a lot of global... One of the big disappointments the Chinese have had with the Ukraine war is that everything that they thought was true for the last 40 years has now been proven wrong. They've always known that taking Taiwan would be harder than Russia taking Ukraine because there's not a land border, it's not flat, there's a moat. They thought that the world would do nothing. And if you take the sanctions that the world has put on Russia and put them on China, oh my God. I mean, the Russian economy isn't great, but it is a massive exporter of energy products and food products. China is the world's largest importer of both of those. So you put a similar lockdown on the Chinese system, you're talking about famine in under a year, not to mention a complete industrial collapse. So every plan, diplomatically, strategically, militarily, that the Chinese have been gaming out for a generation, they now know are completely wrong. And this would be the point where normally you would take your smart people and put them in a back room with some beer and some pizza and say, don't come out until I have a plan B. But Xi has shot all those people. So normally, I would say the chances are zero. But if we're moving into an environment where the Chinese are facing simultaneous agricultural, health, population, and energy collapses, assuming the Americans do nothing, there is something to be said for choosing the time and the place of a patriotic war in order to write the narrative. And if that allows the CCP to remain in power for the low, low price of 700 million dead Chinese, well then okay. So I give it like a 1 in 4 chance. But India is never going to be able to do the multimodal, multi-step manufacturing that the Chinese are capable of doing at scale. They don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the political capital, they don't have the cultural structure. Now, I do think that India will be producing enough manufactured goods within 10 years for their own population. And if you take 1.5 billion Indians and make them a world unto themselves in manufacturing, that is globally significant, yes, but it does not make India a global player. It is a static, statist economy, and that can work for them, especially in their environment. But being kind of the nerve center for global manufacturing, no. It's a moving target, so it's really hard to say. Getting climate predictions down to like the country and the zip code level, we just don't have the data for right now. The biggest impact by far for climate shifts isn't going to be in your industry, in my opinion, it's going to be in agriculture. Because if you move the bands where you can grow certain crops, if there's no population or infrastructure where the bands move to, oops. This is a real big problem in the subcontinent, in the Russian wheat belt, and in China specifically. Those are the places where climate is most exposed to potential changes, and crops are monocultured in high concentrations in very specific climate bands where if they move, you just can't grow it there. So yeah, we're definitely looking at a big problem there. I also don't think that we're going to see the energy transition, though, that is necessary to deal with it. Let me deal with that from 2 points of view. Number one, the technology is not sufficiently mature, in my opinion, to be applied in most places. Solar and wind only work over about 5% of the Earth's surface. It would be about 15% of the global land surface. And for most countries, that is not where the people actually live. So it works in Texas. Dallas-Fort Worth is at the edge of the solar zone. It's at the heart of the wind zone. It will probably be the first major metropolis in the United States to go 100% green, not because there are environmentalists in Texas, but because Texans can do math and they like free. Omaha will probably be second, Denver will probably be third. You can't do that in Europe. And by the way, we'll have to invade Russia too. Just to get the materials to do EVs at scale is just laughable for the next decade. We need a new technological series of breakthroughs in materials science before that is possible. The Texas Triangle is the part of the United States that is likely to experience the fastest economic growth for the next 30 or 35 years. You've got the population centers, you've got a port, you've got a financial center, you've got low, mid, and complex manufacturing all in one place. You plug in the Mexicans to that, they're already plugged into it. The biggest limitation we have right now is infrastructure. And you have all seen the traffic. There's no quick fix for that, but you've been working on it for 30 years, you're gonna be working on it for another 30 years. And if you are talking about the United States needing to double its industrial plant, I figure at least a third of that is going to happen here. Biggest challenge is going to be capital. Texas has cheap land, cheap power, cheap food. That's part of the draw. Low taxes. Capital. With the baby boomers going away, we have to do all of this in an environment of constrained capital and constrained labor. And one of the things we are going to see is that Texas' success is going to hoover up labor from the rest of the country. That didn't matter 15 years ago because there was plenty of labor everywhere. Now it's constrained. And a win here now is broadly a loss everywhere else. Now, Texans are like, so? I get it. But the political splits we have seen between Texas and everyone else is nothing to what's coming, because we're talking about a Texas that is going to be experiencing economic growth rates of like a Korean scale. while the parts of the country that just can't pull this off are drained. So from my point of view, this is maybe a positive because it means we're going to be arguing about something besides the culture war. We're actually going to argue about something that, in my opinion, matters. But it's going to get ugly because success here is no longer necessarily a driver of success elsewhere. If you border Texas and you get sucked in, that might apply. For those of you who are from Oklahoma, you're becoming a satellite of Texas. The Texans are actually reaching out to you to interface on purpose. This is weird. But the same thing's going to happen to Louisiana. The same thing is going to happen probably to Colorado. And while they do have very high birth rates and a more stable population structure, a lot of that is only possible because they export raw commodities and then import the things that allow them to have a degree of modernity. You break down global supply chains, a lot of that goes away. And so I think a lot of Africa is going to devolve. And they just don't have the infrastructure or the skilled labor that's necessary to participate at scale. And even if they did, in a less robust security environment, the connections necessary to make that happen are going to be very thin. So I think it's far more likely that the North American manufacturing system will start incorporating pieces of South America. We already have free trade deals with Colombia and Chile, for example. But yeah, I'm afraid that Africa really can't be part of that. Now, we might see pieces of Africa following the Indian model. I can see Nigeria becoming broadly self-sufficient. I can see a partial reboot of South Africa, but that's for their own domestic markets rather than any sort of international connection.